Part two of our complex inheritance topic is going to be focusing on sex-linked traits, how that works, on a quick review on chromosomes and karyotypes, since we've talked about those in the past, and pedigrees, what they are and how those work. So let's go ahead and get started with looking at sex-linked traits. Sex-linked traits are, well, they sound like what the name implies. They're traits that are linked to the sex chromosomes, and that's how they get passed on. That's how they're inherited, is they're inherited through the passing of sex chromosomes. Think about chromosomes once again. Remember that we have 46, 23 pairs, half from mom, half from dad. The XY, the XY, when that's inherited together, that means it's a male, and the two X's that are inherited mean that you're going to be a girl. So XX for a girl and XY for a boy. So here's a couple examples of sex-linked traits. Hemophilia is one, muscular dystrophy is another. Color blindness is a good example, and we're actually going to be looking at an example here in a minute to deal with color blindness. But how are they inherited? How are these sex-linked traits passed on? Usually, they're passed on through the X chromosome. Most of the time, they're going to be attached to one of the X chromosomes, and so when that X chromosome is passed on, whoever receives it is going to get that allele, going to get that trait. Now, depending if it's a girl or boy, will it show up? So if you look at this example, dad is XY. He can only pass on an X to a girl. He can only pass on a Y to a boy. Mother is XX, so she's going to be able to pass on X's to a boy or a girl. All right? So if you think about it in those terms, that means there's a higher probability that boys are going to inherit a bad X from a mom and actually show up with the phenotype, show up with the trait in their phenotype compared to a girl. Because if the dad has a good X and the mom happens to have an X with the trait linked to it, the dad could pass on the good X to the girl, so that decreases the girl's chances of having these that are passed on when they're linked to the X chromosome. So let's look at my color blindness example. Red-green color blindness is carried on the X chromosome, so it's attached to the X chromosome. So if you have a heterozygous normal female and a normal, let's see what would happen then. So once again, you have a heterozygous normal female and a normal male. Let's cross their genotypes to see what the possible outcome that their children would wind up having color blindness. The genotypes, the heterozygous normal female, she's got a normal X chromosome, and she has an X chromosome that has the color blindness trait attached to it. The normal male has a normal X chromosome and then his Y chromosome. So notice here's the recessive X-linked trait. So we'll set up our Punnett square. We'll cross them, and then here's our results. 25% of the... Alright, then you'll notice that 25% will be heterozygous females. One will be a carrier, but the other X is still a normal X. 25 will be a normal male, and then you have 1 in 4, or 25%, that would be a male that actually carries that trait, and it shows up in his phenotype. Alright, let's do a quick review on karyotypes. We've covered them before, so just remember that there are 46 chromosomes. Half of them came from mom through the egg, half came from dad through the sperm. The karyotype shows them paired together. That's why we have 23 pairs. Right here is your sex chromosomes, so this shows you if it's male or female. X and Y is going to be the male. Hopefully you remember that. And then XX is going to be the female. You can have issues when chromosomes don't separate, and we've talked properly, and we've talked about that before. So notice here on the 21st pair, there's actually 3 instead of 2. So this is known as Down syndrome. Right, and actually it's called, it happens when non-disjunction occurs, and it happens during anaphase 2 of meiosis 2, when the chromatids are supposed to separate, and they don't separate properly, leaving extra or more than one moving into the same side of the cell. So when your gamete forms, it has that extra chromosome. Is this a male or female? Hopefully you guessed it is a female with 2 X chromosomes. Alright, and that was, we weren't going to spend a lot of time on karyotypes. We've covered them before, we spent a lot of time with them earlier, so that should have just been a recap. Let's finish this up by looking at pedigrees. Here's the last new thing we're going to be looking at. Okay, pedigrees are also a way to show inheritance of traits, but it's going to show successive generations or several generations within a family tree, if you will, and how that trait is passed on. These symbols are very important, so you probably want to jot them down really quick to have them in your notes. All of the symbols will always be the same for every pedigree that you see. A clear box or clear square is going to represent a male. Circle that is clear is going to be the female. If it's partly shaded, that's going to mean that you have a carrier, either a male or female. Okay, the lines that connect the male and female means they are married. The vertical line that drops down from that, showing successive males or females connected to that, shows that that is their offspring. So make sure that you're good with those examples. And let's try some. Okay, there are different types of things that we can see within a pedigree. One thing that we can notice is whether or not the trait is autosomal dominant. Okay, and what that means is, remember, autosomes are all of the chromosomes that code for the structure of the organism or code for you. So if it's autosomal dominant, it is not passed along on the sex chromosomes. It is actually attached to one of the other 22 paired chromosomes. Dominant means that it's going to show up in the phenotype. Okay, it's going to be the dominant trait that will always show up. And you can tell if you're looking at an autosomal dominant pedigree, because not only will there be multiple offspring affected in each generation, but their parents will also be affected, and that's a big way to tell the difference. So not only will there be multiple offspring affected, but then the parents of those offsprings, at least one, will also be affected. And you know that what generation you're looking at because of the Roman numerals over here. First generation, second generation, so forth. So this is a good example of an autosomal dominant pedigree. Now, if I were to ask you to tell me the genotypes of each one of those individuals within the pedigree, well, if you know if it's autosomal dominant, you have a few options. Okay, so notice that here you have a mother. She's not colored in, so she does not carry the trait. You have a father that is shaded in, so he does carry the trait. Well, I say carry the trait. The mother doesn't show up in her phenotype. The father, it is showing up in his phenotype. That's why it's shaded. And then they had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. Okay, notice that 2 of the children are shaded in, so that means that they not only carry the trait, but it is shown up in their phenotype. The other 2 children, we don't know, but this is how you can tell if it's autosomal dominant. All right, that means that the dad has to carry the trait that is a dominant trait, and it is showing up in his phenotype. So let's use a big A and a little a for this. The big A means that the trait is attached to it, and it's showing up in the phenotype. The little a means that it is not attached to it. So when that trait gets passed on, there won't be a trait, this particular trait attached to it. Okay, so we know the dad has to have a big A, but we don't know what else. But if you look at the kids, 2 of them will also have big A's. Okay, 2 of them won't have big A's. So the only way that's going to work, if 2 of the kids don't have it and it's autosomal dominant, is for both of those children to have received the recessive trait from each parent. So that means child number 2 and child number 3 should be both recessive, little a. That means that dad must be heterozygous, okay, carrying the trait and it's showing up in his phenotype plus carrying the recessive trait. And the same thing goes for his for child number 1 and child number 4. All right, and then since two of the kids received both recessive alleles, that means mom had to give them one and dad had to give them one. Since the mom does not have the trait showing up in the phenotype, she's not carrying it, so she's also homozygous recessive. So that's a way that you can determine who's what by looking at the children and working backwards. And then here's the rest of it filled out for us. Okay, this child married this, or this girl married this boy. The boy is not shaded in. They at least have one child that's not shaded in either, so that means that child must have received two recessive alleles, one from mom, one from dad, meaning that this child is heterozygous, and the one that that girl married was homozygous for the recessive trait. So once again, you can map it out based on who's shaded and who's not, and looking at their parents. Autosomal recessive, the same concept, but in this case we're talking about recessive traits that are passed on, so it means they have to be homozygous recessive to have that trait showing up in their phenotype. So that means dad right here must be autosomal, must be two little letters, two recessive alleles. The child here must have two recessive, and the child here. All right, since not only just a few, right, there's only a couple that actually had the trait, that means the rest of them must carry a normal trait. But since at least one child received showed up with its phenotype carrying that trait, that means that the mom has to be heterozygous. And then sex-linked. Okay, sex-linked means it's attached to the X or Y, usually the X. That means more boys than girls would probably show up with that particular trait, so that should be easy to notice if you look at one and more of the boys in the offspring or in the generations that follow have the trait and it's in their phenotype. That probably means you're talking about sex-linked. And you can do the same thing we did before by matching up or working backwards to figure out their genotypes. So here's a practice one. You can try it. And that is it.